Hello. Oh, wow, that is loud. Hello. Welcome to tonight's event, Building Connections, Celebrating Progress Towards a Safer Skilled Trades. We are honored to we are honored to celebrate together with you the conclusion of CCWESTT's project, Skilled Trades Workplaces, Engaging and Mobilizing Men as Allies to Prevent and End Gender-Based Violence. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. My name is Jove Nazatul, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the project coordinator here at CCWESTT. So let me take care of a bit of upfront housekeeping. This event is being offered with French interpretation, so headsets for those who require it are available at the AV table right at the back of the room. Please choose channel 2 for French. CCWESTT is also proud to provide ASL interpretation as part of this event. Our interpreters will provide real-time ASL interpretation to ensure that our deaf and hard of hearing audience members have equal access to all the information being presented. So our interpreters will be visible at the front of the room. We ask that our audience be courteous like you already are, and allow for those who need clear sightlines to have access to these, to see the interpreter. If you experience any issues with visibility or interpretation, please inform our staff. We are committed to providing a seamless experience for everyone. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that our greater science, engineering, trades, and technology community is situated on the ceded and unceded traditional territories of the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast to coast. CCWESTT respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples and their relationships to these lands, and will continue to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty made to Indigenous nations and peoples. CCWESTT acknowledges the historical and present-day oppressions, including violence and genocide of the original peoples, their lands, and cultures. All must contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we share together to grow our society. CCWESTT fervently believes CCWESTT is enriched through collective relations and knowledge sharing, and is committed to helping enhance and build these relations. I encourage each of us to become knowledgeable of the lands we are situated on and to assist in long-term collective relationships. It is up to all of us to understand how the land has and continues to nourish, heal, protect, and embrace us, and that we are each land stewards for the present and in the future. We are gathered today on the historic unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, the original custodians of the land now known as Ottawa. We acknowledge and extend our respect to the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who have lived on this land since before memory, as well as the other First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people with whom we share these lands. Some more housekeeping. In case of an emergency requiring evacuation, please use the stairs down that way on the right, just down the stairs. And gender-neutral washrooms are located all the way down the hall this way. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bonnie Douglas, Executive Director and Senior Project Manager at CCWESTT, to the stage. Bonnie's 20-year background in engineering and leadership in food manufacturing developed her passion for solving problems, transforming the workplace, and advocating for women in the sector. She is proud to be using her skills to support the work of accelerating change for gender equity in science, engineering, trades, and technology at CCWESTT. Bonnie?
Thanks, Joe, for opening the event for us. It is very blinding with the sun. I kept saying the sun was going to go a little bit behind the building, so I felt like I couldn't even see you when you, when you were talking from over there. But thanks for that introduction. I am thrilled to see you all here this evening. It's a small group, but I think it's a high commitment, high impact group. When I looked at the list of folks we were expecting today and now looking around the room, this is a really interesting mix of folks that are committed to making change in various ways, and I'm really happy we can gather today in such a beautiful space. So for those of you who are not familiar with CCWESTT, the long form of the name is the Canadian Coalition of Women in Engineering, Science, Trades, and Technology, and we are a national coalition of organizations and individuals who champion a gender equitable, diverse, and inclusive Canadian science, engineering, trades, and technology sector. We build alliances and partnerships and act as a resource hub and advocate with a strong, unified voice. So our gender-based violence work is funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada, and we so value them for taking the lead in providing funding not only to ourselves, but to also many other groups in our network who are advocating for safe spaces in science, engineering, trades, and technology, and even beyond those spaces, everywhere at work and everywhere beyond work. And it's never been more important to resource this type of systems change, and we're grateful to our funder to be able to do this work, and particularly this project over the last 2.5 years. And this project that's really focused on addressing root causes rather than symptoms. And a crucial part of the systemic change that's needed is a much needed shift in learning and workspaces to be safer. Sorry, I'm looking at my two-sided page. There we go. I got that note, then I forgot it. To be safer and more inclusive to everyone, regardless of gender, race, sexuality, disability, and other intersections. So make no mistake, gender-based violence is a systemic issue in workplaces, and particularly those that are male-dominated. Active harm is occurring that affects everyone's dignity, and it's important to include all genders, women, men, gender diverse, in this conversation and change work. CCWESTT supports programs and initiatives that give women and gender diverse people tools to navigate challenges that come with working in male-dominated industries. However, women and gender diverse people only make up at about 5% in the skilled trades in Canada. So I firmly believe that we need to be engaging with the 95% of people, namely men, in order to create real and lasting change in the industry. So that's why I'm so proud of the work we've been doing on our Engaging Men as Allies project. We've worked with many partners across Canada over the past 2.5 years, having regional conversations and supporting allies to put more tools in their toolboxes. With the YWCA Halifax, we have worked to scale their gender inclusive leadership course into 2 provinces, into Manitoba and Ontario. This course is a deep and impactful learning space that was created by men for men to help build their confidence in navigating workplace issues rooted in gender bias and discrimination. Proud partners in this scaling work have been the YWCA Hamilton, the YWCA Manitoba, and the Manitoba Construction Sector Council. The Manitoba Construction Sector Council has also been a key partner in other areas of this work, and unfortunately they couldn't join us here today, but they have been very involved and very committed to the work. They helped bring the Be More Than a Bystander workshop, which is led by the Ending Violence Association of BC, to key stakeholders in Manitoba, including the Heavy Construction Association of Manitoba, who's also deeply committed to this work and this learning journey. Men who have participated in that course have described it as transformational, giving them tools to stand up and be more than bystanders in work and at home. In BC, we collaborated with the BC Centre for Women in the Skilled Trades, the YWCA Vancouver, and BCIT. These groups hosted one of our community co-actions, which is an all-gender conversation exploring how toxic culture impacts men in the skilled trades and what collectively can be done to create safer workplaces for all genders. And these sessions were expertly facilitated by our partners at Next Gen Men, and we have Jake from Next Gen Men to share more on their work shortly. And it's been a really great collaboration. We hope we can continue. We hosted those same conversations with partners in Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, who hosted regional community co-actions in their own individual provinces. And we also worked with Samantha, who is able to join us from Research for Change, who helped analyze and unpack all of that work. And we'll be releasing a report so folks can see and learn from that experience. What we did see, for sure, is an amazing commitment to collective action across Canada in those spaces, and heard from amazing allies who are putting words into action. So we'd love to be able to do much more of that. So through this work, we also scaled the CCWESTT We Are Trades workshop online and into New Brunswick with our partner with New Boots. And We Are Trades is a framework for leaders to give them tips and tricks on how to create safe and inclusive workplaces. And there is a lot more information on We Are Trades back at the table in the back if you're interested in learning more about the active program. So really, I mean, that was a body of work with lots of partnerships and collaborations over 2.5 years. And together we built a network of collaboration that I hope will continue to grow its impact in creating the future of the skilled trades that we'd like to see. So it really is great to see you all here tonight. I know it's a busy time of year, so I'm pleased you could all be here and celebrate with us. And at this time, we're going to give some time to some other partners that we've worked with, which is CAF and France and her team. I know France and her team share a commitment to creating safe spaces. So as partners with the event tonight, we're going to give some time to hear some words from France.
So I'm just going to read out France's bio here. France Davio is the CEO of the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, a national organization that connects employers, labor organizations, educators, and governments to strengthen Canada's apprenticeship systems. A respected national leader in workforce development, France works to advance practical solutions that support apprenticeship completion, employer engagement, and a stronger skilled trades workforce. A respected national leader in workforce development, France works to advance practical solutions that support apprenticeship completion. Oh, I think that I repeated that, sorry. Under her leadership, CAF brings together partners from across the country to share insights, inform policy, and improve apprenticeship outcomes. France.
Hello, bonjour. It's nice to see everybody. Thank you for the invitation, Bonnie and Jove, to speak. I want to thank CCWESTT for their leadership on this important initiative, and to WAGE for supporting the work. I also want to acknowledge everyone in this room, because real change doesn't happen through projects necessarily, or one project here, one project there. It happens through people, through humans coming together collectively and deciding that the status quo is just not going to cut it anymore, and that change absolutely needs to happen. So tonight we're celebrating the project of the skilled trades workplaces, engaging and mobilizing men as allies to prevent and end gender-based violence. And this work matters. You're here, I don't have to convince you, you know that. It matters. But before I go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something very difficult that shook me to the core last November. And that is a 20-year-old apprentice welder named Amber Check was murdered at her workplace in Minnesota. Amber had recently completed her welder training and was just beginning her career in the skilled trades. And according to investigators, a male co-worker attacked her with a sledgehammer at her workstation because he just didn't like her. He didn't like her being there. When I first read the story, it stopped me cold. And I really couldn't just process that something like this would happen in 2025 at the time. Like, how does that happen still? And a lot of you here in this room, I know CCWESTT and CAF, we've been working for years trying to change this, and yet in 2025 this happens. Because while the violence itself is extreme, there continues to be a deeper issue that exposes the underlying reasons why that are not unfamiliar to many women who work in the skilled trades. Too many women or gender diverse workers still, on a daily basis, experience harassment, intimidation, isolation, and exclusion in workplaces that should be focused on learning, teamwork, and safety. And when those experiences happen, people leave. Not because they couldn't do the job, but because the environment made it impossible to stay. And yet right now in Canada, what are you hearing all the policymakers and the decision makers across the country saying? There's a skilled trade shortage. We need more people. There's jobs. 50% of our population is women. There should be enough people in our country to fill these jobs. And yet, as Bonnie said, 5%? That's just, it's unacceptable. We need people to build homes, to maintain infrastructure, to support the transition to new energy systems. And governments talk about recruitment, industry talks about recruitment. But there's another number that we need to continue to talk about at every table every time the door opens, and that is that in Canada, our apprenticeship completion rate still hovers around 50%. That means that, and that's depending on the trade of our region, but that's the general average across the country. That means that nearly half of the people who start an apprenticeship in Canada never finish it. When we talk about labor shortages, we tend to focus on how to bring more people in the trades. But if we're losing half of the people who start, recruitment alone is not going to solve that problem. Completion matters just as much. And when we look closely at why people leave, the reasons are not always technical. People tell me when we talk about this, whether it's with policymakers or with employers, people say, well, it just wasn't a fit. A lot of people who try jobs, it's not a fit. But half the people? Come on, half the people. There has to be something more than is just not a fit. Oftentimes, it's a cultural issue. In the skilled trades, we talk a lot about physical safety. Hard hats, fall protection, lockout procedures, and rightly so. Lives depend on those systems. But there's another form of safety that we talk about far less, and that's psychological safety. Psychological safety means that people feel they can ask questions without being ridiculed. They can admit when they don't know something, which is essential when you're learning a trade. They can raise concerns without fear of retaliation, and that they can show up at work, their full selves, without worrying about harassment, intimidation, or hostility. Apprenticeship is fundamentally a learning relationship. And learning cannot happen in an environment where people feel they have to protect themselves just to get through another day. If someone spends their energy wondering whether they will be mocked, excluded, harassed, they are not focused on mastering their craft, which is what we need in certified tradespeople in Canada, the people that are repairing electrical systems and HVAC systems. These people are focused on survival. And when survival becomes the focus, people leave. It's too hard. We know that women and gender-diverse individuals continue to be significantly underrepresented in skilled trades, and organizations like CCWESTT have spent years doing incredible work. At the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, we've also been working to bring more attention to equity and inclusion across the apprenticeship system. Because when workplaces are more inclusive, they also become stronger. How many years have we been talking about the business case for inclusion? There's research that has been proven that's 30 years old now. But inclusion is not going to happen automatically with research papers being written. It requires intention. It requires leadership. And it requires all of us to take a hard look at the cultures we have created in our own workplaces. One of the most powerful aspects of this project is its focus on engaging men as allies. Men represent the majority of the skilled trades workforce. That means real cultural change cannot happen without them. And the truth is that many men already care very deeply about creating respectful workplaces. They care about their coworkers. They care about their apprentices. They care about the future of the sectors. But sometimes they don't always know how to step into the conversation. But projects like this help create that pathway. They help people understand that being an ally is not about being perfect, not about saying the perfect things. It's about being willing to speak up in the first place, to mentor, to challenge behavior that undermines safety and respect. Because culture shifts through small, everyday moments on the job sites, in training halls, or in classrooms. This project may be reaching its conclusion, but the work itself is far from finished. If anything, it's becoming more important, because the future of the skilled trades depends not only on a technical excellence, but on the environments we create for the people entering this sector. environments where apprentices feel supported, where workers feel respected, and where everyone understands that safety both includes physical safety and psychological safety. If we want more people to enter the skilled trades, if we want more apprentices to finish, if we want to solve the labor shortage that we talk about every single day, then we must build workplaces where people feel safe enough to stay. So tonight I want to thank everyone who contributed to this project, and I want to thank all of you, the supporters, the allies, the project partners, and thank you to CCWESTT for your leadership. Very important. Thank you.
Thank you, France. I believe you stole my script. Thank you so much. And so I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Jake Sticker. As Next Gen Men's co-founder and executive director, Jake is passionate about changing the way we see, act, and think about masculinity towards a future where boys and men experience less pain and cause less harm. Jake is most proud of speaking at the United Nations, co-authoring a kid's book about masculinity, and becoming the new publisher of Voicemail magazine to continue a 40-year legacy chronicling the pro-feminist movement. He's recently completed his master's in social business and entrepreneurship at the London School of Economics. So, Jake.
All right, and the mic is on. Thank you, Stuart. Oh. Hello. It's a small room. I don't know that we have seats for everyone, but I'm going to talk for 20, 30 minutes, so I want to make sure you're comfortable. If you want to sit down, feel free. I'm a very chill guy. That's how I describe myself. I can't actually see my own slides here, and that is not my deck. It's the CCWESTT deck, Beyond Male Allies. Yeah, France, that was sorry, I lost France. Hi, France. That was a great introduction. I heard a quote recently that toxic environments are why men quit jobs and why women quit careers. And I wanted to, it's a difficult role because male allies is mostly the term that we use, but to complicate that term a little bit necessarily as well to show why perhaps maybe we're not getting as many men as we hoped for to step up and into these conversations, and to share a little bit about how we make a better invitation to them for their uptake. There it is. Great. So to do that, I want to share with you 3 ways that I learned to be a man. The first way that I learned to be a man was a gentleman, and that was taught to me by my grandmother back when I used to have hair. And I was about 7 years old, and I remember being on public transit with her and her nudging me because an elderly gentleman with a cane was getting onto the bus. And she nudged me, told me that I should give up my seat, and as many grandmothers do, took me out after for a sweet treat and explained to me that as a young man, it's my job to give up my seat to anyone older than me with mobility issues, parents with children, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're 7 years old, everyone is older than you, so you're going to get used to doing that a lot as well too. And so I learned early on that being a gentleman should cost you something. Then, as much as I learned from my grandmother, I also learned from my grandfather, and he was absolutely a patriarch. It was his way or the highway. Whatever he wanted to do was what the family would do. He was incredibly domineering, and that's what I learned a lot about masculinity as well too. I was a doorman on and off for 10 years. Not a bad gig to get when you're 5'20", over 250 pounds most of your adult life. And in that role, I saw some people having the best days of their lives, celebrating sports victories, bachelor parties, bachelorettes, et cetera, and I also saw a lot of people having some of the worst days of their lives as well too. And in that capacity, I also used power and strength to enact justice as I understood it at the time. I'm not necessarily proud of how I lived in those days, but something that I learned from that as well too, and that I think is relevant in this work of inviting men into the conversation, is if you exclude yourself for past actions from being and stepping up in the future, a lot of us can't necessarily do this work. And so what do we learn from that? How do we take that work forward? Another way I learned to be a man is to be a Stoic. This is my East European father and what constitutes a smile. He wasn't a patriarch, but he was absolutely a Stoic. And I'm often asked, Jake, what got you into this work? Why do you care about it? And for me, it was my struggles with mental health in my late teens and early 20s, because I subscribed to very masculine narratives. You got to be tough. You should never show emotion. You should never ask for help. And I was pretty lucky after, at 19, tanking my varsity athletics career because my coping mechanisms were substance abuse and aggression, being able to bounce back, and then at 22 ended up in therapy for self-harm. And my girlfriend at the time was a women's studies graduate, and she introduced me to that transformative concept of gender norms, if you can believe it or not. And while I was going through that, my best friend, who I co-founded this organization with, unfortunately lost his 13-year-old brother to suicide. His brother was a young black man experiencing homophobic bullying, and we worried that that was the path he chose for himself. And through Jamal's loss and my own struggles, we formed a pretty unique male friendship based on emotional support, vulnerability, being there for each other, things that most 24-year-old guys don't get from their male peers. And we graduated, we went off to do our own things, and eventually got the chance to create Next Gen Men together, and it's been that work over a decade now. So those are 3 ways that I learned how to be a man, and I think that we need to change that conversation. That's why we talk about changing the way we see, act, and think about masculinity. And this term, male allies, why do we use it? The statistics were spoken of tonight, where 95% of the industry is men, so we need them at the table to have the conversation. But we have to ask ourselves, how's it going? I think we had some really transformative conversations in our work together with Trevor and those types of things, but the majority of the industry was not there. They're not showing up for these events, so how do we get that conversation forward? And what I think we're having in these conversations often is a conversation where we've been pushing on the gas pedal for women and girls, and we've evolved the norms, the stereotypes, the expectations. We've made a lot of progress, and we have much more to go still. But simultaneously, we've been holding the brake on men and boys and norms and roles and expectations for them. And I don't know about you, but when operating a motor vehicle and holding the gas and the brake at the same time, you start to spin out. And some of these conversations lately feel like we're spinning out, right? So how do we have a more productive conversation? So I want to share with you 3 ways that I think that we can do that. And the first one is the ally argument, which is, I think, the classic one, and that's overcoming the gentleman a little bit. I apologize for the lighting. These slides sometimes don't look the best, but let's start with a definition of allyship. An ally is someone who actively supports and defends the rights and dignity of individuals from social groups other than their own, especially when these individuals are not present or otherwise able to represent themselves. How do we feel about that definition? Thumbs up? Yeah, for the most part? Yeah. I take one issue with it, and it's very pedantic. Allyship is a verb, not a noun. We need to take action, right? It's not just a title that we bestow upon ourselves or those types of names. So I think unless we're actively taking action, we're not really practicing allyship. And so to recap as well too, to be an ally should cost you something. You know, that's a lesson 7-year-old me learned when I had to give up my seat, right? But nowadays, when we're asking for men to step up as allies, it needs to be in the form of time, in the form of money, and the thing that they're most reticent to invest is social capital, right? So when I am standing here on stage, this isn't an act of allyship. I'm gaining recognition right now. But when I go to the gym with my friend group and they make a sexist remark, we're a bunch of basketball bros, so they're talking about the WNBA, and they make a sexist remark about it, and I say, hey guys, not cool. That's allyship because I'm spending my social capital and our relationship in that moment to further the conversation as well too. Allyship is also a title that can only be bestowed upon you by another. You know, let's not go around changing our LinkedIn statuses to Jake the Ally, but wait to be invited to events where we can show up and spend some of that social capital, spend some of that time, spend some of that money, and be recognized for our efforts in that as well too. And allyship is also something you get to do, not something you have to do. Especially today when we look at the news, everything is heavy, everything is distracting, right? And sometimes we just want to turn it off. We want to put our head, in a book or doom scroll some other stuff. But when you are a woman and you're experiencing misogyny, you don't get to turn that off. When you are a person from an affected population abroad, you don't get to turn that off, right? So to be an ally means you have the privilege to step into that as well too. And being an ally also involves recognizing power and privilege on a systemic, organizational, and individual level, which is why some of the conversations we've been having with CCWESTT have been so powerful, because the question has been posed, what does this mean for the industry? What does this mean for your company? And what does this mean for you, right? We need to move through all of those levels to make change. And if you don't think about allyship within that, what you end up practicing often is this idea of being a protector and a provider. It's this old male narrative. And it's, I have power, I might be the foreman, and I'm going to protect and provide for the women in my group, in my circle. And though that's necessary, but it's not changing the narrative, because if you retire, if you change companies, that doesn't exist there. It's not transformative necessarily in that nature. And a lot of men feel comfortable in that. And I just want to share a quick graph here to prove what I mean a little bit. 2 out of 3 men, so 62%, would be willing to help a woman in distress whose house burned down, but fewer men, 45%, would donate money to a woman whose business burned down, right? So more interested in protecting and providing rather than supporting for women to stand on their own 2 feet and to make their own money as well too. The second way that I think that we can move this argument forward is the beneficiary argument. So I don't think this will happen in this room, but I often find myself in many rooms where I say patriarchy and people say, oh, that was like 2 generations ago. We don't do that anymore. So it's helpful for me to help define it. And patriarchy is pater, father, archein, power, father power. And through this father power that has persisted in places of worship, in government, in businesses, the most influential areas of society, we have created a gender binary, and we see this perpetuated in a lot of our conversations about what is masculine, what is feminine, but not only a binary, a hierarchy, right? Read that top line: masculine is strong, rational, assertive, feminine is sensitive, emotional, passive. What do you want in the workforce, right? So when we codify these things in this binary and hierarchical way, and we don't see it as a fundamental human expression that we all have these traits and need to practice these traits or else we're stunted, we perpetuate this. And this binary and hierarchy gets further complicated by our different lived experiences, our socioeconomic status, our ethnicity, our culture, our faith. All of these play a role in forming how we show up to these conversations and what we believe about them, right? Personal experience drives a lot of the narratives in this space. And one question we have is, or the framing we have this conversation through often is, how does patriarchy benefit men and boys? And I was asked to go through today pretty quickly, so I'll save the audience participation moment. But when I ask about the Canadian gender wage gap, I get a lot of varying perspectives around that. That's what a woman earns for $1 of work the man does as well too. And with statistics, you can play with them a bunch of different ways, and people have tried to manipulate the numbers to close this gap as much as possible. But there's this stubborn 11% that we call the motherhood penalty. And that's when women are climbing in their careers and have to take a step back because physically they need to. They're the ones bearing the children, and they pay a price for that in terms of their earnings and career progression potential. And it's worth noting as well too, this wage gap is white women to white men. This looks vastly different when you complicate it with indigeneity, newcomer status, race, those types of things as well too. Globally, women are 51% of the population, and only 14% of states have a female global head of state. And so, again, going back to that challenging the patriarchy narrative, if we believe that, women have equality, then we should see at least 50% of countries have this representation as well too. Many of us here are invested in an RRSP or a 401k. Maybe not a 401k, that's an American vehicle, but our fortunes are tied up in the Fortune 500. This is a group of companies that drives our retirement. And so we need to see representation of that. And so out of those 500 companies, only 55 have female CEOs, 11%. And I put the asterisk there because that is an all-time high, right? So we still have a lot of progress. And when we look at just that head of state or just that CEO, that's only one layer of leadership. What does it look like for the VPs, for Congress, for Senate, for all those layers as well too? We need to look at representation. So that's one narrative, right? When we look at it through that narrative, it's very clear that men benefit from patriarchy, right? And all of those statistics are women's disadvantage, and the inverse of that is men's advantage. The very same system and culture that upholds those statistics is the same system and culture that upholds these statistics. In Canada, 3 out of 4 suicides are men. We lose on average 4,000 people to suicide. That's 3,000 men a year that die by suicide. We often talk a lot about young men, which is obviously very tragic. I believe it was last year, aside from accidents, suicide was the second leading cause of death of young men. But the vast majority of male suicide is actually men 55 to 65. It's men who've subscribed to a narrative of masculinity over their lives and expected a certain set of outcomes. And they're often on their second marriage, their children are estranged from them, workplace is pushing them out, and they don't have the skills and capacities to turn to other solutions. Men die on average 4 to 5 years earlier than women. Some of that has to do with unsafe work as a comparison. Some of it has to do with risk-taking behavior. I think about a guy I went to university with who jumped off a balcony in Mexico and paralyzed himself. And then some of it has to do with, that uncle or grandfather who has a pain in their side and they're like, oh, I'm not going to go see a doctor until it's too late, right? Men's violence is an issue. Men are the primary perpetrators of all forms of violence, and aside from gender-based violence, men are actually the #1 victims of all other forms of violence at the hands of other men, right? And 75% of opioid deaths are roughly men across Canada. Many of them working in skilled trades as well too, getting injured at work, getting addicted to prescription drugs. And 93% of our incarcerated population is men, right? And so in this same society and culture of patriarchy where men benefit as a class, and it's very clear that we do that, that same culture has these incredibly negative outcomes for men. And so what can we leverage from this knowledge to invite men into this conversation that we don't just need to be allies and do this for other people, we should step into this conversation and change the narrative around masculinity and patriarchy for ourselves, because our liberation is tied up in it as well. And I often look to bell hooks for a quote from this. You can look at the quote in full, but I paraphrase it as, the first act of violence that patriarchy asks of men is not that against women. it's that against themselves. And should they fail to psychologically and emotionally cripple themselves, they'll be met by a group of men that will do it for them. Right? So, if that's the case, how do we bring men into the conversation as stakeholders as well? Bear with me, this is a little bit of a timeline here, but as I walk through it, imagine a young man in your life. Could be your son, could be a nephew, could be a friend's kid, and imagine them. What we do to boys, and inverse girls, but I'm talking about boys right now, is we put them in a box from day one, right? So before they're even born, we ascribe boys equal blue. And I always think about, again, I'm a basketball guy, this former NBA player, Gordon Hayward. And he was doing a gender reveal with his partner. It was a safe one. It was a cardboard box with a balloon. Nothing was lit on fire, none of those extreme ones. And the box opens and pink balloons come out. And he already has 2 daughters. And his wife asks him, "Is Daddy happy?" And he goes, "Daddy's always happy." And you could just see how disappointed he was that he was having another daughter. And this is a tiny human being who hasn't even arrived and introduced themselves yet. We don't know who they are, right? And so how can we have these expectations of our children before they even arrive and introduce themselves? Then we know that men physically distance themselves from male toddlers earlier than women do. Right? When they're babies, we all goo, gaw, kiss, cuddle, but then there's a physical distancing that happens. And the children aren't young enough to register this. Their mom, their grandma, their auntie still cuddling them, kissing them, loving on them, but the men have pulled back. What is that, right? And they start to register that men aren't intimate to each other, right? And that is what we call the father wound from a young age. Then we send boys out to play, and we give them the narrative of boys will be boys, and we give them a lot of permission to do that as well too. Yet we also then expect girls to be prim and proper and behave themselves. And when we put them into early school, we see boys are now radically diagnosed with behavioral issues, right? And you might get upset about that. You might feel broken and you might start crying, and then someone says to you, "Boys don't cry," right? And then the next paper cut that happens is we put you into sports, and sports is competitive, and you're supposed to win, and you're supposed to dominate, and you're supposed to crush. And if that doesn't happen and you face resistance, you have to man up. You have to push through, right? And then we see a lot of high school age boys, their first they're told that to become a man is to lose your virginity. So all of their, this is a very hetero example, interactions with the opposite sex come through that interaction. And we know that the vast majority of women's first experiences are unwanted. Not necessarily assault, but not how they'd imagined for themselves. And you see a boy who has had intimacy distance from him, told his emotions don't matter, and that when he faces resistance, he has to push through. These young men don't have the skills to step up into those conversations. And I'm not saying that to excuse it, but we have to understand how we're raising our young men that end up in these outcomes as well too. Then we see them getting into workplaces and schools where everything is a competition or a domination for outcomes. Then we see them getting incredibly isolated and lacking the skills to make friendships as they graduate out of schools and sports organizations. A very innocuous story I like to tell is imagining that if I go on a double date with my partner, her friend and her friend's partner, and me and the guy hit it off, we have a great night, it'd be very weird for me to say, "Hey man, I had a great time, can I get your number?" It's a very innocuous statement, but men can't do that. They just expect others to do that emotional labor for them. So we are paper cuts of patriarchy out of a lot of these processes as well too, and it accumulates over our lives. And I'm being a bit sensational in my story here. Not all of these things happen to everyone, but hopefully you can imagine that it happens to boys in one way or another. I'm going to skip this one. That one's a little in the weeds. But ultimately, this is a culture of competition and domination. And we see that permeating in workforces as well, too. So I'm going to land the plane, and Jove told me that I have till 40 after. Maybe we'll have time for a couple questions, because I don't love talking at people. But Next Gen Men's been around for 11 years, and here's a few things that I've learned doing this work. One is that allyship is not enough. It's part of the conversation. But boys and men need to be part of the conversation for their own health and healing, right? I think when we broaden the tent, invite everyone to the table, we can have a better conversation about these things as well, too. This work is anti-patriarchal. I'm a feminist. I call, Next Gen Men a pro-feminist organization. For a lot of people, that's a giant F word. I don't really care if they call themselves that. But if they can see that patriarchy is a culture that is harming people of all genders, and they want to change that, that's anti-patriarchal, which is feminist, by the way. And then I think it's really well summed up by Rachel Giza here in this quote. I'm glad we've begun to raise our daughters more like our sons, but it will never work until we raise our sons more like our daughters. And for some people, even just reading that statement is threatening, and they have to question why that's threatening to them as well, too. It's so deeply ingrained in our society and culture. So to land the plane, I learned how to be a gentleman from my grandmother, how to be a patriarch from my grandfather, how to be a stoic from my father, but ultimately through my own healing, learning, and unlearning, I've learned that I should be a stakeholder, and that's why I believe that we need more men as stakeholders and not just allies. Thank you very much. That's the fastest I've ever done that one. Your arms must be tired. I have 5 minutes for any questions, if that sparked anything for anyone. Yes? Yeah. So, where to begin? I think there's an extra challenge nowadays as well, too, where there's so much polarization happening between men and women as well, that we don't have a lot of shared experiences, right, outside of work, for example. We deal with folks like from middle school to professional, and when we look at the teenagers we work with, their Instagram, their TikTok For You pages, they don't even see the same things. And then you look at political radicalization as well, too. A lot of people just are arguing across things that they don't share. So workplaces are really important, and workplaces have a role to bring people together in that sense. And we need to, like men absolutely need to broaden what happens in those boys' clubs as well, too. They shouldn't even exist in terms of boys' clubs, but how do you bring someone in to be more like you? And we, as men, it's fair to call out, do that. We do it with new men who enter the group as well, too. So how do we extend that same invitation to women, right? The difficult part is that you see it happening on the flip side in female-dominant workplaces as well, too. There's just this cliquish nature. And so I think organizations really need to step up and organize and facilitate those opportunities where people get to know each other. Otherwise, I see it persisting in a lot of ways as well, too. I don't know if that fully answered it. Yeah. So part of it would be kind of asking what is not serving you right now, right? Because there's a few men, the Trumps of the world and those types of things that this system is absolutely serving. When we see the types of influencers, media, politics that men are gravitating towards, it's often because something isn't serving them in a way. They feel precarious, they feel zero-sum conversations, they feel like nobody is offering them empathy for their mental health, those types of things. And so how do we sit with them in a empathetic and curious way, right? And invite them into that. So if it's about a boys' club, is your boys' club serving you? Can you talk about the difficulties of life? Can you, we do mental health workshops in companies, and men are struggling with the sandwich generation. They're taking care of their kids and their parents at the same time, but they're expected to have narratives of not complaining and sacrificing themselves in order to provide for that situation. Where's their emotional labor outside of their partner in that, right? Who is, the guy over the beers being like, man, that sucks about your parents. My mom was, immobile a couple of years ago and we had to do this, like we're in it together, right? So trying to find the ways of like how the status quo is not serving them what they need as well too. I think anytime we approach these conversations of what you believe is wrong, you need to stop believing that, now believe this, like everyone's super defensive about it. But how can you start to make it wobble, right? How can you start to dislodge it so that maybe not the first conversation, maybe not the second conversation, but over time they can unpack that and experience an alternative as well too. I'm looking this side of the room now. No?
How do you move from the idea of men as stakeholders in the dismantling of patriarchy to actual active dismantlers of the patriarchy? Because there's two different things. It's like recognizing that you've got a stake in it is one thing, but actually doing the things that need to be done, and that includes lifting up and supporting women, right?
Yeah.
Also, and gender diverse people.
Yeah.
So how do you move from, okay, like we've got you, like that mind shift that you're talking
Yeah.
about, to more active owning the problem in an active, like in a way that
Yeah.
says, this is what I'm going to do in my organization or in my role in order to disrupt this pattern?
Yeah. Allyship in action, right? And that's that like verb piece of that definition. And what I would say, and I want to say this acknowledging like the empathy of like how frustrated people must be with men. Like, what the hell, right? I totally get that. But how do we approach this conversation from a strengths-based lens as well too, right? So simultaneously, while there's all this bad stuff happening, this generation of millennial dads is 3 times more engaged than any generation prior and have just matched the level of caregiving of boomer mothers, right? So I'm very excited for what's going to happen in 15, 16 years when there's a generation of kids who had their dad actively involved at home and the narratives that shifts, right? Some of the Catalyst research shows that 97% of men believe in gender equality, but they have that risk of that social capital that they don't want to necessarily expend. So how do we start to create the safe spaces to challenge some of those narratives? And maybe it's not challenging the narratives impacting women and gender diverse folks first, but how do we tackle some of those narratives of the system not working? So for example, I was at the He for She conference in New York a couple of years ago, and there was a logistics company from the United Arab Emirates there, and they were talking about how they operate these cranes, and it's 40-degree heat in the desert, and they couldn't get women into the cranes. And then they realized with all the sensors and cameras and all that stuff, they could actually move that job out of the crane into an air-conditioned office and operate it that way. And all of a sudden they had more gender diversity. And that's a huge win for gender equality. Then the question is, why are men disposable in patriarchy that we never innovated in that sense before? And so that's what I mean of like, how do we get men seeing the injustice served to them in the banner of this patriarchal narrative as well too, and then be like, yeah, that sucks for me too, right? And then we get really excited about it together. But I also understand that it takes work to get to a space of having that conversation. And when you've experienced it your whole life, like it's just a hard starting point.
What would your approach be to create change in, leadership positions
I think if we are frustrated, like that deserves to be pointed at leadership first and foremost. And when we as an organization get hired to work in a company, oftentimes they want to say, oh, work with our frontline staff and not necessarily the C-suite, which is frustrating work, right? Because the people who've gone through that culture and risen to the top are the ones that give permission of how it's going to be, right? And a lot of this is built on the ideal worker, and the ideal worker was someone without caregiving duties, right? And so how do we complicate that narrative? How do we get men in leadership seeing, you know, many of them will stand at a podium and be like, oh, I'm here, I believe in mental health, but what are you actually doing to do that? And some of them, like the light bulb moments they have when they're just invited into certain things. At a company that we worked with a bunch of tech leaders, they talked about, yeah, I support, you know, people taking mental health days. And I just asked them, when was the last time you took a mental health day? Oh, right? And then all of them committed to taking a mental health day in the next quarter, and not necessarily like doing it in that performative way, but they have to understand that, you know, what you role model is what persists. And that's why we need men taking parental care. We need men who are facing the sandwich generation to take elder care leave as well too, to make sure that others can follow that and create those opportunities to backfill those roles as well too. I think I'm out of time, so I'll pass it to Jove, but I'm going to hang out if anyone has any further questions. I just want to say thank you for the attention. Or to...
Jove, are there some slides that you want to show? Thank you, Jake. Thank you so much. I feel like your spirit was with me when I was talking with my taxi driver yesterday. So he asked me what I was doing when I came to Ottawa, because I was telling him I was traveling to Ottawa. And I told him, oh, I work in gender equality. He said, oh, okay, so is that men, women? I said, yes, and gender diverse people. Oh, okay, all right. And I had mentioned that only 5% of skilled tradespeople in Canada are women, and he said, oh, it's very labor intensive though, like there's lots of women can't do those jobs. So I challenged him with the idea of rethinking the jobs, just like you had given in your example. I said, so there's many men, the men working in skilled trades, who are getting physically injured by the physical nature of the work, and you're equating that with strength, and therefore they need to be big and masculine. So, but they're being injured, and they're in a culture where they shouldn't talk about it. And did you know that that often leads them to self-medicate, and there is an opioid crisis within the skilled trades workers for largely that reason? And he said, oh, I didn't even think about that before, right? So there's lots of opportunities to have that conversation when you, and I was reflecting on some of the material that I talked with Trevor about from Next Gen Men, right, when I had that conversation with him. So just a reminder that there's lots more conversations like that need to happen. So thank you again for all of you being here tonight. Thank you, Jake, especially for sharing your experiences with us and spending some time answering those questions. Inspiring the next generation, making a better space for boys and men is an ongoing contribution to equity in STEM and the skilled trades, and we acknowledge and thank you for doing this hard work. And it takes all of us truly to make this vibrant and supportive community a welcoming place where everyone can be seen, heard, and thrive. So if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, there's lots more to come. As Franz was saying in the beginning, this project is ending in its current form, but the work continues. There is an opportunity coming up in May in Calgary, which is the CCWESTT Biennial Conference. It's called Beyond Boundaries, and it will focus on collective impact, lots of talk about real change, and will feature themes of allyship and additional themes such as anti-racism, reconciliation, and best practices for creating safe and inclusive learning and work environments in all of science, engineering, trades, and technology. We're partnering with Engineers Canada. We have some Engineers Canada folks here today. APEGA, the Alberta regulator on that conference, as well as the Office to Advance Women Apprentices Alberta, to bring tons of community-led content, learning from industry, not-for-profit organizations, associations, post-secondary institutions, sharing, learning, and talking about and having further conversations like this. So Thank you to, I have to do some thank yous now, to my amazing and supportive CCWESTT board. I have 3 members of the board here today. So thank you to the board for supporting me and the team in this work, as well as some project advisors specifically who advised on the project. And thank you for France and the team at CAF for partnering with us on this event. I hope we can continue to partner on events like this in the future. And last but not least, thank you to my amazing CCWESTT teams. We have Jove, who you saw at the onset, Janet, who supports our communications, and there's a few not in the room today, Laura and Justine, who also supported this crucial work. So thank you to my team for that. I'm going to give them a little round. And to our event organizer, we have Brittany, who's from Coherent Solutions, who helped arrange this beautiful space at the National Arts Center. And thank you, too, for the National Arts Center for hosting us today. We have some food, we have some drinks, and some time, if you can stay, to continue discussing. We're a small enough group, I think you can meet everybody in the room before you leave, and you probably should, because there's some really interesting folks in the room. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll chat with you in a little bit.